That's Brother Limbo. Well, quit beating your word. You have, that means you have then. Yesterday, quit beating yesterday.
Well, good morning. Time to begin this morning, so got all the way down here and realized that I forgot the microphone, so I had to walk back up. So we'll continue our study on foundations of our faith this morning. I think everybody knows last week me and Christy were sick, so hopefully the sickness is moving out of the Crosswhite household, and hopefully we're getting done with that. She's here. She'll be here this morning. She's not back to 100%, but she's still doing good. River's doing better, so hopefully all that on its way out. Appreciate Brother David for filling in last week. And the last lesson, so 2 weeks ago, so the last lesson that we did in this study was on the Lord's Supper. And then Brother David did a lesson on the attitude of taking the Lord's Supper last week, and that fit well with our study of the Lord's Supper and our overall study, Foundation of Our Faith. So we'll continue in Section 3 this morning. Everything in Section 3 is focused on worship. So we just finished, we've talked about worship in general, talked about preaching, prayer, Lord's Supper. This morning we'll start a 3-part study on singing. And so one thing that I want to note is, or that we can see by the outline here, is that the third lesson of the singing, lesson 36, is all about instrumental music. So I'm going to do my best in parts 1 and part 2 to stay away from the idea of instrumental music and anything associated with that. We'll cover all those questions and all those topics in the third part of the third part of our study on singing. So maybe sometimes when we talk about singing, maybe we focus mostly on instrumental music, and rightly so. Obviously, there's a lot in the religious world that teach falsely on the use of instrumental music in worship service. But I want to make sure, for our study of Foundation of Our Faith, that we give singing itself the full focus that it deserves in our study regarding singing and worship. So I'll do my best. If I ask that any comments, let's try to keep any comments regarding instrument and music to part 3. But as we looked at different other aspects of worship here in section 3, we've been focused on fundamentals. Typically, we've started each study with a basic question like, "What is the Lord's Supper?" or "What is prayer?" or something like that. So we're talking about the fundamentals, and it makes sense to me to start at the very bottom, understanding that maybe there's most of these lessons, if not all these lessons, and the content we've all heard for many years, but maybe we have not ever stopped and asked ourselves the question, "What is the Lord's Supper?" or something, for example. So we'll do the same thing with singing, but I don't think that we have to ask the question, "What is singing?" I think we all understand what singing is. It's sort of self-explanatory. But I think the question of why do we sing during the worship service is a good fundamental question to start with. What is the purpose of singing? And this is what we'll look at this morning. Why do we sing as part of the worship service? Why is it included as an act of worship? Well, if we start with 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 4, Peter says, "To whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ." So the first thing I think kind of sticks out, verse 4, we see that Peter is referring to Christ as a living stone that's been disallowed by men, but then chosen of God, and he's precious. This reminds us of Matthew 21, chapter 42, when Jesus talks about himself being the chief cornerstone, or the stone that was rejected by men, and now it's become the head of the corner. So the idea there is that Jesus came, and the Jews rejected him. The Jews did not listen to Jesus' teaching. They rejected him and crucified him. But then God chose Jesus. God, not only we have this stone that was rejected by men, but then God took this stone that was rejected and not only made it precious, but made it the chief cornerstone, or the head of the corner, which would be essentially the stone that all other stones are laid by. So you think about a stonemason. The analogy here we can see, think about a stonemason. He might reject a stone because it's not square, right? It's not square. So as he's checking all the stones, up, this one's not square, he discards it. That's essentially what the Jews did to Jesus. They discarded him as a stone that was not square. But then God took Jesus, and obviously because of his sacrifice for us, not only did he choose him as a stone, but he chose him as a stone that by all other stones are going to be laid by. If you think about that chief cornerstone, that's the one that's laid, and all of the other stones are squared from that one chief cornerstone. So, but this is the idea that Peter is talking about in verse 4. But we can notice that what Peter mentions in verse 4 is that Christ is a living stone. And the fact that Christ is a living stone shows his significance, right? He's not a dead stone, or he's not a material stone. And the Jews obviously placed so much emphasis on the temple and all the physical parts of the temple. We see that throughout the New Testament, throughout the Old Testament as well. But the Jews placed so much emphasis on the temple and all the material things of the temple and all of those dead stones of the temple. But here Jesus is a living stone. He's a chief cornerstone of something that's going to be far greater than a physical temple. Obviously, the physical temple served its purpose, but the whole point of the Old Testament law was to point to Jesus. So when Jesus came, the Jews should have recognized, how much more precious he was and his law was than the physical law. But the idea that Jesus is a living stone, we can see the significance there, that he's living. He's not a dead stone or a material stone. then verse 5, Peter refers to us as lively stones or living stones as well. And he says that we make up a spiritual house. So again, there's not, we're not members of a dead house or a dead building. We're not members that make up a physical building. We're members that make up a spiritual building. And this spiritual building is laid with Christ as the chief cornerstone. Then we can notice that Peter calls us a holy priesthood. The priesthood of the Old Testament was a physical priesthood, right? But we as Christians under the New Testament are part of a spiritual priesthood. So along those lines, think about what does a priesthood do? If you think about the Old Testament priesthood, they offered sacrifices, right? That was one of the many things they did was offer sacrifices for the people. Now Peter says that we're a holy priesthood, we're a spiritual house, and that we are to offer up spiritual sacrifices. So the function of the Old Testament priest was to offer physical sacrifices as part of their physical priesthood. Now obviously, we as Christians under the New Testament, any sacrifices that we would offer would have to be spiritual sacrifices under our spiritual priesthood. But we can see the connection, the comparison and contrast there between the Old Testament priest and the New Testament priest. But one thing we can note is that any spiritual sacrifices that we make today under the New Testament law are not sacrifices that relate to redemption or atonement, right? So the Old Testament sacrifices related generally specifically to sin or redemption or atonement in some way. The high priest offered he put the blood on the mercy seat on the Day of Atonement, so you had the whole system of laws and things associated with atoning of sins in the Old Testament. But the contrast we can make in the New Testament is that any spiritual sacrifices that we make are not related to salvation or atonement, because Christ has already made the ultimate atoning sacrifice for us. So any sacrifices that we need to make are not related to salvation or atonement. Christ has already atoned for everything. So then, what are the spiritual sacrifices that we are to make today under the New Testament? Well, verse 9, Peter says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of Him who hath called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. So Peter mentions specifically that you should show forth the praises of Him. Why should we show forth praises? Him being obviously Christ, our God. Notice in verse 5 that the spiritual sacrifices that we make are acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So there's any sacrifices that we make are not acceptable without Jesus' ultimate atoning sacrifice. So the connection is always through Jesus. But Peter says, show forth the praises of Him being Christ. Why would we show forth praises of Him? Well, because He has called us out of darkness into His marvelous light. Again, this is Christ's ultimate atoning sacrifice that He made for us. So the Old Testament priest served in the temple as part of a physical law, but we can see that we as Christians today serve in the church under a spiritual law. The Old Testament priest served in the temple by offering physical sacrifices, and we serve in the church by offering spiritual sacrifices. And one of those spiritual sacrifices that we can offer is praise to God for what He has done to us and what He has given to us, salvation. So I think this is an interesting contrast, and we'll see this as we go through the lesson, probably through the continuation of our study of singing on the next two lessons. But the idea of spiritual sacrifices, I think, really makes an important distinction for singing in the New Testament. We'll see that as we move forward. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 3 talks about that there needs to be something to be offered. So if you think about the Old Testament law, for example, the process of them offering sacrifices, in order for there to be a sacrifice, there must be the priest must have something to offer. That's what we see in Hebrews 8, verse 3. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man, talking about Christ, have somewhat also to offer. So obviously, in order for there to be a sacrifice, the high priest must have some kind of gift or some sacrifice to offer. And then Jesus as well, in order for him to offer his ultimate atoning sacrifice, he had to have something to offer, which was himself. Of course, the Old Testament priests offered daily physical sacrifices as part of the Old Testament law, and then we as New Testament priests are also to offer daily spiritual sacrifices. But again, in order for there to be a sacrifice, there has to be somebody to offer the sacrifice, and there has to be something to be offered, right? So we see two parts of a sacrifice. Well, we've already seen that that praises to God are spiritual sacrifices that we may offer. But as we dig a little bit deeper, I think we can see that there's more spiritual sacrifices that we can offer in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15 says, "By him, therefore, let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." Notice again that he mentions by him. By him here again is Christ. So notice Peter had said that our spiritual sacrifices are only acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So again, Jesus has offered the ultimate sacrifice for us. So any spiritual sacrifices that we offer can only be acceptable through him or by him. Hebrews here says by him. But here the Hebrew writer specifically mentions the fruit of our lips as the sacrifices of praise, and it's directed toward thanksgiving. So, how can we use our lips to offer thanksgiving to God? Well, we've already looked at prayer in a previous lesson. That's certainly an option. We talked about the different kinds of prayers, supplications, intercessions, thanksgiving. So prayer is certainly an option as a way to use our lips, the fruit of our lips, to give thanks to God. The Lord's Supper is another one. As we're partaking of the Lord's Supper, it's specifically in the prayers of the Lord's Supper, but inherent in the Lord's Supper itself is that part of thanksgiving, right, where we remember Christ's sacrifice and we remember to be thankful for his sacrifice, what he's done for us. So all of these, we see there's multiple ways we could use our lips or the fruit of our lips to give thanks to God. But also, singing might be the first one that comes to our mind. Singing is a way that we can use the fruit of our lips to offer thanksgiving to God. So singing is a spiritual sacrifice that we may offer to God. So this is really the answer to the question we asked at the beginning of our lesson. Why do we sing in worship? Is it because that we like the songs? Not necessarily, at least not primarily. The primary purpose of singing is to offer spiritual sacrifices of thanksgiving and praise to God and worship to God. So this is ultimately why we sing in worship. Now, if we remember the Old Testament sacrifices, eating of the sacrifice was part of some of the law, right? For example, depending on the type of sacrifice, not all the sacrifices were eaten, or not each sacrifice was able to be eaten, and then not all of every sacrifice was eaten, but there were specific portions and certain types of sacrifices where the priests could partake of the sacrifice. So, what was the purpose of the sacrifice? Does that mean that the purpose of the sacrifice was to feed the priests? No, obviously the purpose of the sacrifice was to offer a sacrifice, an atoning sacrifice, or maybe a peace offering or something. Whatever the specific offering was, the purpose of the sacrifice was to offer for some sin in accordance to the Old Testament law. Just so happens that the priests were able to get some benefit out of the sacrifice because they were able to partake of the meat of the sacrifice. Same thing with us as Christians today. We're priests under the New Testament. We just looked at how Peter told us that we're essentially New Testament priests. We're part of a holy priesthood, part of a spiritual house. And the priests under the Old Testament were the ones that offered the sacrifices. We as priests under the New Testament are the ones that offer the spiritual sacrifices to God. So if we offer a spiritual sacrifice to God in song, doesn't mean that we can't gain some benefit of the song, much like the priests gained the benefit of being able to eat of the sacrifice in the Old Testament. But the primary objective of singing is not for our enjoyment, right? The primary objective of singing is for worship to God, worship in a way that God has commanded us to worship, and worship to Him, offering those spiritual sacrifices to God. So it doesn't mean that we can't gain from it. We can't gain we could even say significantly from singing, but it just we just have to remember that the focus, just like the focus of the Old Testament sacrifices were sin, atonement, the focus of our spiritual sacrifices today are worship to God. And of course, we may get enjoyment or uplifted through the songs we sing. We may like the songs or the message or the melody or whatever, and that's perfectly fine. But any benefit that we get is just additional, to the praise and the thanksgiving that we're giving to God.
How do we get the benefit of the teaching? Singing is teaching and admonishing, so you're teaching me and singing, I was doing the benefit.
Right, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily just makes me feel good to sing, but we can learn from singing and stuff as well. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So something else we should note as well that I think is important, if we think about singing, we think about the worship service, think about offering spiritual sacrifices to God. If we think about the Old Testament law, how many of the priests were required to serve? Or I know all of them were required to serve. If you were a priest, you had some service that you were responsible for. At least I'm not aware of any time where we find that it was biblical for a priest to say, well, I'm going to set out this sacrifice. I just, this is not my forte. So-and-so offers sacrifices better than I do. So I'm just going to watch or something like that, right? So the same thing is true for our singing today. If we become spectators, and not participants in our singing, then it would really essentially be the same as a priest refusing to offer a sacrifice under the Old Testament law by saying, Ed does it better than me, so I'm gonna let Ed do it, and I'm just gonna watch Ed do it. But the idea of the priest, the role that they played, they were required to do this service. And as we see as singing, these are spiritual sacrifices that God has ordained for us to do during worship. So it's important that we all participate, right? It's something we participate in collectively. So I think that's important. Maybe it's something we don't place the emphasis on, but I think if we look at it from the standpoint of, or what are we learning about singing today? Singing is a spiritual sacrifice for us as Christians. It's an image of the physical sacrifices that were offered under the Old Testament law. If I was a Jew under the Old Testament law, I don't think I would be happy if I brought an animal to sacrifice, and the priest said, I'm going to set this one out today. I'll get it next week or whatever it is. I think that's the same kind of attitude that I think God sees to us if we don't participate in singing. Now, if you've got something that for some reason you can't, obviously we're not talking about that. If there's some limitation for whatever reason, even if you're sick, sometimes you lose your voice. Obviously you can't sing if you don't have a voice. But we're talking about willingly not partaking in singing in part of the worship service. I think we can see the importance of it when we think about it in terms of spiritual sacrifices that we're offering to God. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I think Satan works, and he might work us in a lot of ways, right? And it's easy to say, well, like you said, it's just singing night. Maybe I won't go tonight. Um, but I always, something me and Christian talk about is, I always look at it as, if I felt the way that I do right now on Monday morning, would I still go to work? If I still go to work, I probably need to be going to church. But then also, I look at it from the standpoint of, what if Jesus said, "Well, I don't feel like going down to earth and dying for these people today." If if uh, if He could endure all that, then surely we could endure some of the hardships that we have in life. But the Hebrew writer gives here in chapter 13 gives some additional spiritual sacrifices that we can partake in. In the next verse, verse 16, he says, "But to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased." The word communicate here in the King James really means um, sharing, essentially. So this would be like giving, benevolence, maybe giving alms, things of that nature, sort of fellowship, sharing together, helping each other. If you think about the benevolent work of the church, would fit with what he's talking here. So these type of good works that we as Christians do, again, are sacrifices that are spiritual sacrifices that are pleasing to God. So we can see that there's several types of spiritual sacrifices that we can offer. In fact, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, we might say goes even a little bit one step further by saying that essentially, we can offer ourselves as a spiritual sacrifice. He says in Romans 12, verse 1, "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." So again, our entire life should be lived as a spiritual sacrifice to God. Everything that we do should be we should live our lives that way. I think this also aligns with the picture of the Old Testament priests. So remember how the tribe of Levi had no land given to them. They were the one tribe that didn't have land that was distributed to them. Also, they were the only tribe that could serve in the priesthood, that could serve under the Mosaic law and the priesthood and service to God in the Old Testament. So really, you see their entire lives revolved around serving God under the Old Testament law. So again, I think we can see that picture of here Romans 12 verse 1. The sacrifices, the spiritual sacrifices that we make to God is not something we just do on Sunday morning, right? It's something that we do every day. Notice that what we said before, the Hebrew writer says, "Offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually." So it's something that we do continually. It's not something that we do just on Sunday morning, but it's something that we do all of our life. Now that doesn't mean that. So obviously there's a distinction between singing in the assembly and singing outside the assembly. We can see there's a distinction between the church assembled and the church not assembled. We can obviously still sing. We can obviously still praise God outside of the worship service. We can still give thanksgiving to God outside of the church assembling together. But obviously we've looked at this a few times in our study up to this point. But there's a distinction that can be made to the church assembling together in one place. So the singing that we do here is not the same. It's not the same necessarily as the singing that you do outside of the worship service. It's something we'd all do collectively together. We take the Lord's Supper and all of that. But we understand what Romans 12 verse 1 is telling us is that everything that we do is as a living sacrifice to God. We present our entire bodies, our entire lives everything that we do is in service to God. It's not just on Sunday morning, but it's every day of our life. So what else can we learn about singing? Well, James 5, verse 13 says, is any among you afflicted? Let him pray. Is any merry? Let him sing psalms. So we have seen that both prayer and singing are spiritual sacrifices that can be offered by the fruit of our lips. So we can learn here that obviously and we already know this obviously, but there might be different times or different emotions or different needs that may be reflected in the specific fruit of our lips. So when we are sick or afflicted, like James says, if we're sick or afflicted, we may pray to God. So in our study on prayer, we talked about the different types of prayer, supplications, intercessions, and thanksgiving. So obviously, those different types of prayers may be offered at different points in times in our life. And we talked about that with prayer. The same thing may be true with singing. There could be different songs that we offer depending upon the different times of our lives, or maybe how we're feeling, or whatever it is. But we can offer similar spiritual sacrifices in song at different times in our life. For example, we sing songs about God's blessings and our thankfulness. So if we're happy, we want to express our thankfulness to God. We sing songs like "Count Your Blessings" and things like that. So we have songs dedicated to God's blessings and our thankfulness. We sing songs of encouragement after the lesson. Generally, we have a song of encouragement, and that's to help invite those that may need to respond to the Lord's invitation. But we see that song, generally the words of that song maybe have a message that is intended to help us invite those to respond to the Lord's invitation that may need to. We sing songs that help guide our minds into the Lord's Supper. So before we take the Lord's Supper, we generally sing a song that helps guide our minds toward Jesus' sacrifice or something to that nature. We sing songs lots of times to facilitate the opening or the closing of our service. Maybe there's a song that helps us enter into worship service to God, or maybe there's a song that we might sing some about as we leave, serving God as we leave every day or something of that nature. But it's common for us to sing songs to facilitate the opening and closing of the worship service. We sing songs that might relate to the topic of the lesson. So again, talking about teaching, and we'll talk a little bit more about teaching in a minute. But again, talking about teaching, the words of those songs may have a specific lesson to teach us, but also they help guide our minds toward the lesson itself, the message there. We sing specific songs during baptism sometimes, or during weddings or funerals. So again, different occasions, different emotions, different times in our lives may merit certain songs to be sung. And going back to Psalm chapter 137, beginning of verse 1, by the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. So this is the psalmist is talking about the Babylonian captivity. They've been taken away. They're sad. They remember Zion. Verse 2, we hang our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they carried us away captive, required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Verse 4, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If you think about the Israelites here are sad that they've been taken away into captivity. And when they're asked to sing a song, they're saying, well, how can I sing a song? How can I sing the Lord's song over here in captivity? I've been taken away from Jerusalem, from our homeland, the city of God. They remember Zion. They're remembering the city. We're over here in captivity. How can we sing a song about the Lord's song over here? So again, that emotion they felt, the sadness, obviously would be reflected in the song. Maybe now, even if they're made to sing that song, you would think it would probably also be reflected, at least be reflected in the execution of the song, right? Maybe if Israel is sad that they're in captivity, they're not in Zion, and their captives make them sing a song of one of the songs of Zion, probably the delivery of that song was not nearly as good as the delivery of the same song that might have been sung when they went back to Jerusalem, right? So, again, there's different occasions may call for different songs to be sung, but again, the whole purpose of the singing is directing our worship to God as spiritual sacrifices. We might also sing for joy. The psalmist again says, Psalm 66, beginning of verse 1, make a joyful noise unto God, all ye lands, sing forth the honor of his name, make his praise glorious. Say unto God, how terrible art thou in thy works. Through the greatness of thy power shall thine enemies submit themselves unto thee. All the earth shall worship thee, shall sing unto thee, they shall sing to thy name. The psalmist mentions here making a joyful noise, giving honor and glory to God, worshiping God. So again, there's a joyful spirit associated with that. Psalm 95 is similar. O come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth. The strength of the hills is his also. The sea is his, and he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. So again, here the psalmist mentions making a joyful noise. He talks about coming to God with thanksgiving. He talks about how great God is, the wonders of God's creation, the wonders of all his works. So again, we can see the example here of singing for joy. And that's probably the one we might think of most when we think about singing. We think about singing when we're happy. But maybe, what about singing when we're not happy? Or singing when we're in trouble. We may not think about that as much, but we can also sing when we're in trouble. So Mark chapter 14, verse 26, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. So this is Mark's account of the Last Supper. So Jesus had just finished the Passover with his disciples. He just finished the institution of the Lord's Supper. They're about to go out into the Mount of Olives, which we know when they get there, Jesus goes into the garden and prays 3 times that this cup might pass from him. He tells us, shortly after this, maybe around about the time they're singing, he tells his disciples that one of them is going to betray him. So he knows that Judas is going to betray him that night. He tells Peter that you're going to deny me 3 times. So if I put myself in Jesus' shoes, I'm not sure that I would be in the mood to sing a song at this time. Because obviously, he knows what's coming, right? We know that his heart was heavy that evening. We know that he prayed to God. But even though Jesus was about to face all that he was about to face, shortly after this, it didn't stop him from singing a song with his disciples before he left the room there from the Passover. So we don't know what song they sung, obviously. Maybe it was a happy song. Maybe it was a song that was about compassion or about sacrifice. I don't know. But again, we can just see the picture here that we can sing when we're happy. We can sing when we're sad. One example we use quite often is Paul and Silas in prison. Acts chapter 16, verse 25, at least when we talk about singing. And at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. So if you go back to verse 23, we're told that Paul and Silas had received many stripes. So they were just beaten, prior to this. They're in prison. This is late into the night at midnight. And they're singing, they prayed and sang praises to God. So again, if I put myself in this situation, if I've just been beaten, I've been locked in the prison, it's midnight, I'm not sure that I would be thinking about singing a song. I would probably be just full of despair about, oh, look, poor pitiful me, look what's happened to me, look what I've endured, look what I'm enduring. I probably wouldn't feel like singing, but Paul and Silas, didn't let this time of trouble or this time of potential sadness stop them from singing. Again, we don't know what they sang, but we just know that they sang praises to God. And then the last point we'll look at this morning is we talk about singing is teaching. So again, singing, what can we gain from singing? When do we sing? We sing for joy. We sing when we're in trouble. We sing to teach others. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. Whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father by Him. So we mentioned it briefly already, but singing is a method of teaching others. The words of the song or the message of the song can help us teach others and even teach ourselves. But songs can be a tool for teaching the gospel, or even just growing in our knowledge. But this also presents a responsibility to us as Christians, to those that may be writing songs that are intended to be used in worship. Verse 17 says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. So we think about what responsibility do we have to the songs that we sing. They need to be they all need to be done in the name of the Lord Jesus, which means that they need to be truthful, right? There needs to be truth, and these songs need to be free from error. So if we're singing songs offering spiritual sacrifice to God by songs that are not biblical or not scriptural, then that's obviously not pleasing to God. If you think about Nadab and Abihu, right? They offered service to God in a way that was not in accordance with God's will, and they were punished. If we think about we as New Testament priests and the spiritual priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices to God in a way that's not in accordance to God's will, I think we can see Nadab and Abihu as the example there. Now, God's not necessarily going to strike us dead today, but we understand that the punishment there is sin, and ultimately would be punishment in the day of judgment. If we don't correct ourselves, correct our error. But we have that responsibility as we're teaching in song. Obviously, the lesson that we're teaching must be in accordance with God's will in order for our sacrifices to be acceptable to God. That's our lesson this morning. So we've got 2 more parts of singing. I don't think I've ever really looked at singing this way in the form of a spiritual sacrifice, but it was really helpful for me in a lot of ways. Maybe we sometimes underappreciate the singing of our worship service. Maybe we like the singing, we like the songs, but I think maybe it's easy for us to become complacent as Christians. We've got a lot of songs in the song books, but a lot of us have probably been singing, a lot of the same songs for decades or our whole life. But I think it's easy for us to become complacent and kind of lose sight of what are we doing when we're singing? Well, we're offering these spiritual sacrifices to God, and it's something we should focus on and place importance on. Right. 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 Actually, you actually reminded me. I left off, but I had that verse on there, and I forgot I even. So you mentioned it, reminded me that I had it on there. That's good. Yeah. Go ahead, Roger. Right, yeah.
Don't look through it, and but the bottom line is, whatever we do needs to be acceptable to God. You mentioned they have a Bible, you wouldn't be able to accept God.
Right. Right, exactly.
You need to be serious about our daily walks of life as well as our worship. Doing things that be acceptable to God.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, maybe we won't be struck dead necessarily today like Nadab and Abihu were, but those, you know, those Old Testament lessons are there for a reason, right? We're told that those the lessons from those things written aforetime are for our learning. So maybe we don't have to be afraid to offer incense because God's going to strike us dead. But we understand that the lesson there is it's even more important for us because you know that could be we could just be punished one time, which would be eternally, right? If we live our whole lives and we don't live in accordance to God's will, like you're saying, we don't offer our sacrifices to God in a way that's according to Him, then that punishment could ultimately be on the day of judgment. So yeah, it's important that we understand. That's one of the things that I like about this outline. I've said it several times is that we talked about worship. You know, we've already talked about what is worship. We've talked about John 4:24. We've talked about spiritual authority. So I really like how this outline sort of builds on itself as we go. And when we get to instrumental music in a couple of weeks, we don't have to go back and cover all of that about spiritual authority or authority in worship because we've already covered it. So anyway, any more comments or questions this morning? All right, thank y'all.